Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Beth Chats Books. Now today's video is going to be a recap of some of the reads that I've been reading since I finished my BookTube semi-final reads for this round. So I finished kind of at the mid-June point. I finished those books, and so from then till now, which is kind of second week of July, I have been enjoying some ebooks. I just want to do a quick shout out to libraries and how useful and important libraries are. So during COVID I have taken some books out from the library and I have got round to reading them. I've got them till October now, but obviously I took them out in March time, so I have finished them. But what has been so useful is recently I have downloaded the app for my library that gives me access to ebooks and audiobooks. And it has been so exciting to be able to read current reads now through that medium of the library. The library is so useful to us, and my app has been really easy to download. There's been plenty of brand new things, and I think we really should be supporting our local libraries, especially booktubers. When I first started BookTube, there was a lot of pressure to buy books, to have bookshelves behind you, to show that you were a reader, and to do hauls all the time. But in reality, if you're going to be a booktuber or if you're going to be somebody who reads a lot, then the library is a really important resource, and these books are free. All these books that I'm going to talk about, I didn't pay a penny for. So it's really important to celebrate and to appreciate our libraries and how useful they are. And I would be entirely lost throughout COVID without having access to this library app. So I just love the libraries. I just think they're so important, and it's been really exciting because I've always told myself I'm more of a physical book reader, but I've been really enjoying ebooks on my iPad, so that's a big fat lie. So anyway, let's get stuck in with what I've been reading. So the first book I read was Kill the Black One First by Michael Fuller. Now this is a memoir about Michael's life growing up in London, and he's a black man, and about his experience with living in care and then going forward to working for the police and then becoming quite senior and high up in the police before he left. What's really interesting in this memoir is he doesn't actually have anything nasty or negative to say about care, and he realises as he gets older that he was quite lucky because he had a very maternal figure in his care home that really looked after the children there. She was a bit of a mother hen, and she really supported him. And also he didn't kind of realise until he started getting older that he was one of the only black children in his area, in his care home. And he didn't really realise that this mother hen figure, who he loved to bits, was different to him because she never really made him feel that way. But then as he starts getting older and he starts going to school, and then he has this dream of working in the police, he starts to realise that he is different because he is black. So he encounters a lot of racism throughout his time at the police and with the police and different areas of working in the police. And he remembers all the things that his care mother used to say to him about dealing with it, and how it's not personal, and different coping mechanisms that she kind of tried to bestow upon him to deal with it. And he starts to realise that he's been quite passive in his experience, and he's allowed racism to happen around him because he's been too scared of it affecting his career and his development in the police. And then he starts to kind of voice his distress and his disbelief, and tries to implement, as he gets more senior, some kind of consequence on this racism that he incurs every day at work. And at first it doesn't go very successfully, and then the police are a little bit slow. Things like the Stephen Lawrence case allow them to try and look at race, but the reflections that he makes is that there's still a long way to go for the police, and there's still a long way to go in the UK before we are anything like an anti-racist system and country. And he says, but it's quite interesting looking at this blend of racism in the UK, and then he does talk anecdotally about visiting America and visiting a friend, and how the racism there is a lot more visceral and visual and there, and not as insidious as here. I feel like our racism is a lot more insidious. It's wrapped in that trying to be more polite and British and feigning ignorance on a lot of things here, whereas I think in the US you have quite blatantly open, aggressive forms of racism. Anyway, it was absolutely fantastic. I gave it 4 stars. I think it's really enlightening on the topic, and in particular, I haven't seen many people talk about this book in relation to the Black Lives Matter and the movement of people trying to read more inclusive black reads. But this is really useful if you want more of a British perspective, and if you want to learn more about the police, because in particular in the UK, our police historically has had an issue with race and the recruitment systems. Big cases like the Stephen Lawrence case, police in the UK have handled it badly, and so I think this is a really interesting resource from somebody who's worked in the police as a black person, and how he's suffered racism within the police, but also racism from his own community. There's sections in it where he talks about his father who's moved over from the Caribbean, Jamaica, and his friends and himself, when they hear that Michael wants to join the police, are very discouraged by that news. They tell him of all the times when they've had issues with the police. So it's really interesting. There's big protests that he turns up to, and the black community are actually shouting at him, calling him a bumperclot and other derogatory terms, words that the Caribbean community use. And they call him a coconut, which is really interesting, basically saying that he's black on the outside but white on the inside. So he deals with a lot, and it's really informative, so I gave that 4 stars. And then the next book that I read is She Said by Megan Twohey and Jodie Cantor, and this is the breaking the sexual harassment story on Weinstein. Now, I haven't read the other one. I have the other one on my shelves, which is the Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow, which I will give a little bit of time before I read that, purely because I know they're going to be very similar in content. So this goes through the Weinstein scandal and how certain women were really important in breaking that story. It does also touch briefly on Trump, because Meghan, I believe it was Meghan, before she went and had a baby when this book starts, she was really trying to go after Trump, and she had a lot of people come forward about sexual harassment, and it kind of fell like a lead balloon, and from there she was a bit disheartened. But then Jodie picks up on a lot of things that's happening with Weinstein and people who are tentatively deciding to come forward off the record, which means that it wouldn't really amount to much, but it's starting the process of trying to encourage these women to then discuss it on the record. And then the New York Times, I believe they work for, I keep getting really confused because there's a lot of New York newspapers, I believe it's the New York Times, so if I've got it wrong, apologies. Someone senior in the paper tells Jodie, if you want to go ahead with this story, you need to speak to Meghan, because she did so much work on the Trump scandal, with when the video came out of grabbing women by the pussy and all that kind of thing. She was there, so she would be a really helpful resource. And then as the book kind of develops, they create this partnership of trying to get these women to talk. So there are some famous names in here. The most famous one that I think people will know is Gwyneth Paltrow, and how they chipped away at trying to get her to come forward. Then there's people who work directly for Weinstein. And then it does talk briefly about Brett Kavanaugh as well within the story, because at the end they bring all the women together, people from the very beginning that were talking about sexual harassment that happened with Trump, then victims of Weinstein, and then the one victim of Kavanaugh that's come forward that we know. And then they get to kind of share their experience. So it's really informative, and it's a very heavy topic, and I just find it completely mind-blowing that there is such evidence that is reconfirmed by other people's accounts of such horrendous abuse, sexual and physical and mental, and nothing gets done. In particular, Trump I find very frustrating, because Weinstein's kind of had his comeuppance now. We've seen the pathetic images of him going into court with the Walker going into court and then obviously being found guilty, we've had some kind of justice for that scandal breaking and for everybody involved. But I think with Trump, the fact that he's president and some horrendous things have come out about him and there's been no repercussion, I find quite sickening, to be honest. Anyway, loved that non-fiction, really got into it, so I gave that 4 stars. I really enjoyed that. And the next books I read actually were quite pleasant surprises for me. So I picked the first one up on ebook and I decided if I don't like it then it's fine, I've wasted an afternoon max. And the first 2 chapters I was really sceptical. I thought, oh god, this isn't for me. You know, it's kind of teen angsty, I'm not feeling it. And then I really got into it to the point where I downloaded the second book straight away and really, really enjoyed it. So the first one is One of Us is Lying by Karen McManus, and the second one is One of Us is Next by Karen McManus. So this follows Bayview High School, and it follows a group of kids. So at the very beginning of the first one, 5 of them are in detention. So one of them is a nerd, one's the kind of school drug dealer, one's a bit of a snitch. He runs this website online where he finds out all this gossip about people and he posts it online anonymously, but everybody knows it's him. One's a jock and then one's the kind of prom queen type figure. So at the beginning of the first novel, the sketchy guy ends up, he has an allergy to peanuts and drinks peanut oil at this detention they're all in, and he dies. And then the whole school are trying to figure out who spiked him and what's going on. So it follows that story. And then the second book follows the second, kind of the semi-second generation of the Bayview High. So the nerd, I never know how to pronounce her name, Brownwyn, her sister Maeve, is in their last year of high. So Brownwyn at the end of the first novel moves to college, and the jock Cooper gets a scholarship, and Nate, who has a bit of a love interest with Brownwyn, ends up moving on. And there's Addie as well, who has a change of character throughout the book. So she's a bit of a princess and then she becomes a bit of a rebel, and she sticks up for everybody else, and she ultimately helps find out what happens. In the second book, Maeve's in her last year. They've all moved on, but they kind of cameo back into the story. And there is somebody who's doing a copycat of what the first guy did before he died, of this weird, insidious website kind of thing, finding out all this gossip. So then we go through Maeve's story with Maeve's friends, Knox and Phoebe, and help find out who's doing this copycat website and why. Also, Maeve has a bit of a love interest in the second one. So I liked being in the Bayview High environment. I actually think she wrote it really well, and these characters are very fleshed out. I thought they were going to be one-dimensional and really irritating and very preppy, high schooly, but they weren't actually. And the way she's written these whodunits is actually quite clever, because it could ultimately be anyone. The second one actually I did figure out before the reveal, but the first one I didn't. And they are just really good self-indulgent afternoon reads where you could just literally have a coffee, read it in a few hours and feel that instant gratification of getting a book read. So I actually really did enjoy them. I don't know if there's going to be a third one. People are hinting there's going to be a third one, and I definitely will read it if there's a third one. I know she's written another book about kind of a similar thriller, but about a different environment, and I'm not really that compelled to read that one. But, you know, if I'm ever stuck for something to read, I will. But I would actually highly recommend Karen McManus, because from the front cover it looks very teen preppy. But if you like YA and you like thrillers, I'd definitely give it a go, because I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed those 2 books. And then the next book I read was Swimming in the Dark by Tomasz Jorowski. I'm terrible. I'm really sorry. I actually was going to Google how to pronounce that before this video, but I forgot. So this follows 2 men, Ludwig and Janus, in 1980s Soviet Poland. So at the very beginning of the novel, it's more like a novella. It's very, very short actually. They are sent to this camp because apparently it's kind of mandatory that everybody goes to this farmer's summer camp and does agricultural work, so they're actually pulling beets out of the fields and, you know, contributing to that summer. And they meet each other at the camp, and they start this kind of semi-friendship where they meet at the lake at night, and Yanis is always swimming. And then at the end, Yanis asks Ludwig, do you want to come travelling with me for the rest of the summer? And they have a bit of a summer fling. And then they get back and they kind of don't seem to agree politically. So Ludwig doesn't appreciate living in Soviet Poland. He doesn't think that it helps the people. He's seen people without food and there's more rationing, and Yanis is a bit more enthralled and kind of indoctrinated into the Soviet system, and he gets a job working quite high up in the political Soviet sphere, and he meets a woman called Hannah, who he kind of met before camp, but he's starting this kind of fleeting romance with her, keeping her sweet because she's kind of giving him a lot of connections. So in reality, he wants to be with Ludwig, but the way that the setup is, even in 1980s Soviet Poland, as you would understand, being gay isn't illegal, but it isn't certainly not something you want to admit. So in the end, Ludwig realises he can't have this relationship with Yanis, and he flees to America because he doesn't want to live in a Soviet regime. So it's actually quite heartbreaking. I don't actually know what to make of it, really. I think I did give it 4 stars because I really enjoyed it, but when I reflect upon it, I don't really know what its aim was. It felt very much like someone had given you a flavour of something and it hadn't really developed. I don't know whether it could have been fleshed out, and it was almost a set of letters and musings and monologues by Ludwig about missing Yanis, and then reflecting on that very zoomed in part of his time when he knew him. So wider purpose, I don't know, but when I read it, I did enjoy it. So, and it was very well written, so I think whatever this author produces going forward will be interesting and worth looking at. And then the next one I read is This Reminds Me by Derek Oyusu, and this is a bit kind of similar to Michael Fuller's book in a way. It does follow this character, a young man called Kay, and we follow him growing up in care, then slowly being raised by his mum who has a second child, and then about him and the child being raised in London, a very crime high area, and a bit of musings on his demons with alcohol and his self-destructive behaviour, his mental health, diagnosed with bipolar. It's actually very hard. I'm trying to look at my notes actually to discuss this book because I don't really remember anything about it, and I read it quite recently because I think Derek's used to writing poetry. I might be wrong there, but this has a dreamlike quality. It's very lyrical and it's not very structured, and it doesn't really read like a novel. Yeah, I've kind of said it's almost a novella, and it has some narrative vignettes with verse poetry. It's very hard to pin down, and I think that's why I would only give it a 3/3.5, because I just didn't feel immersed in the story. I think I'm quite traditional in that sense. I kind of like narrative, and I don't mind verse poetry, but I don't access it at the higher levels. My intelligence doesn't mean I get the most out of it. So I would recommend it to people. This is also another British focused narrative on Black lives, and it's also very recent, and I've seen it's all over the library. They've been trying to promote it a lot on their ebook website as well, and I think it would be worth it for people because again it's very short, but I just don't feel like I got the most out of it at the time of reading, so maybe it might be easier reading it on audio as opposed to actually physically reading an ebook or a book. Because I also finished Fight of the Century, Writers Reflect on 100 Years of Landmark ACLU Cases. So AC is the American Civil Liberties Union in the US. So this goes from the 1930s to present day cases in the US, and then each writer kind of picks a case or a selection of cases that were relevant to a topic and writes a small essay on that topic, on how it's affected them and why they support the ACLU or not support the ACLU. For example, one writer is very angry at the ACLU's decision to support the ruling that during political campaigns people can put any amount of money into a political party, because he believes that that's creating a society in America where Trumps and people like Trump, millionaires, are able to dominate the political sphere because they have the money to pump into a campaign, which is very interesting. But then the ACLU's main belief system is about supporting free speech and protecting the amendments that were created through the Constitution. So sometimes that works in the favour of civil rights and civil liberties. For example, they've gone to the Supreme Court to protect the right for interracial marriage, for trans rights in the work environment, for LGBT communities, but they've also then supported things like the Irish St. Patrick's Day parade, where they've supported their choice to not include the LGBT community in their march because that's how they want to represent their private organisation that way. So it's so interesting because it shows the nuance of American politics and the complexity of it, and how there are certain debates over whose right is more important, the right of an American neo-Nazi or of an American black lesbian. So, you know, because a lot of these amendment rights inflict upon one another. So that was really interesting to think about. There's some fantastic names contributing to this collection of essays. You've got Ann Patchett, Salman Rushdie, Marlon James, you've got Neil Gaiman, Jesmyn Ward, hundreds of others. Not literally hundreds, but lots and lots of others. There are a hefty amount of essays in here. It goes through things like Indigenous people's rights. One was really important about how for the Indigenous people a lot of their children were being taken into care and taken away from the community, and how the ACLU really helped them stay within the community and get adopted by extended family members. If in the 30s, if a person moved from their state to California to seek work during the Great Depression, that was illegal at the time. It discusses Miranda rights. There's just so much going on and it is so informative. So I ended up giving this 4.5 out of 5 stars because it's just so informative on the topic and there's so much to think about. And this is such a good book to start the topic going on how you feel about the American political system as it stands now, and what does the American Constitution mean to American people, and the amendment rights. So much to pick apart and discuss, and it's just really well collaborated and put together, and there is so many interesting essays, and I love that both sides of the representation of people agreeing and disagreeing with the ACLU, and having all those different voices have their opinions. Such celebrated and revered authors have their take on it. It was just really, really good. And then the next book I read was a massive disappointment, and that was Strange Hotel by Emma McBride. So I think I gave this 2.5. I previously tried to read Emma McBride's Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, and I didn't actually get on with it that well because of its stream of consciousness. So for some reason I didn't know whether this would be stream of consciousness style or not, and I thought maybe she might deviate, but that seems to be her style of writing, which is fine. And I've read Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf and loved the stream of consciousness in that, but with this she tends to throw so much into her stream of consciousness that I have flickers and glimmers of understanding what she's talking about, and then it gets taken away from me. But when Girl is a Half-Formed Thing was dealing with a lot of heavy topics, and there was trying to be a narrative thread through that, this seems kind of pointless. So she goes around to all the hotels that she previously went with a ex-partner who we kind of determine at the end has died, and then there's a suggestion that there might have been a son, but I didn't really understand that bit either. She goes to all these hotels, she drinks a lot of alcohol in them, she muses very self-indulgently on her life, and then she has these liaisons, these sexual liaisons with men, and then massive self-indulgent monologues about that. So there was no thread, no narrative, which, you know, as you can tell by now, I like a narrative, I like a point, even if it is a little bit dark or strange. And if I can't understand something, if I just can't connect with it, then there's really nothing there tangible for me. So I've actually looked on Goodreads, and I don't think many people have given this a high rating, but it just, again, is a bit similar to Swimming in the Dark in the sense that once you finish it, you're starting to question what the point of it was. And I don't really want to waste my energy reading a self-indulgent book about someone just musing on how shit life is now. Because it's just not entertaining as a reader to read that. So yeah, I only gave that 2.5. And then I'm just going to quickly round up what I'm reading now because it's about 30 minutes into this video. So I'm currently reading Little Deaths by Emma Flint, which is a thriller that was on the long list for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2017. I'm only about 8 or 9 chapters into that, and I think there's 20. Enjoying it so far. It doesn't have that pull and grip of a thriller that quite a lot of successful thrillers do. So I can understand where it kind of shaped out in the end, because it didn't make it to the shortlist in 2017. And a lot of people's feedback was that it just didn't do what they wanted it to do. And I can get that. The writing is really good, but there's just not that latch-on effect that I have with thrillers sometimes, where I'm compelled to keep reading. And I've just read a section in it where the reporter's kind of sexually fantasizing about the mother who's lost these 2 children, and he masturbates over her, and I just found that a little bit crude, because obviously I know there are some men out there who are creepy and are attracted, and obviously the woman is presented as an attractive woman, but I just felt a bit like, oh, well, maybe that was just the shock factor, but I don't know. I'll have to see where it goes. And then I'm also going to listen to Hagseed on audiobook, because I actually have it from the library and it's the only book I have left to read, but I thought maybe I'll listen to it on audiobook because I don't really have the intention anytime soon of physically reading it, but then if I get it done, then I might take a little bit of an ebook break and read some of my physical books. So that's everything that I've been reading recently. I'm really sorry this is very waffly, but there was a lot of books to talk about. But thank you guys so much for sticking with me and watching it, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.